A trillion here, a trillion there, and pretty soon you're talking about real money.
You know, it's funny, that original quote was about billions.
Exactly. And
Okay.
today, that just doesn't cut it. The trillion-dollar scale is really the only one that captures what's happening with U.S. government debt. It's not about counting dollars anymore. It's about these massive systemic fiscal gaps.
It really is.
So our mission in this deep dive is to get past all the noise coming out of Washington. We want to focus on one stark reality.
Which is?
We're analyzing the current trajectory of U.S. debt, and this is the crucial part, how this puts the world's biggest creditors, especially in Asia, squarely on the hook.
Right. Who's funding the machine and what kind of leverage does that give them?
That's the question.
And the timeline here is just, well, it's pivotal. The U.S. economy is set to hit a very uncomfortable, frankly, historic financial milestone in 2026.
This isn't just a talking point, then.
Not at all. This is a real fiscal event that's going to shape the global conversation. We really need to grasp the colossal scale of this internal challenge before we can even begin to understand the global implications, especially for the biggest holders of U.S. treasuries, in places like Tokyo and Beijing.
Okay, let's unpack that. Let's anchor this in the actual numbers.
Because
They're staggering.
they are.
Washington is dealing with a fiscal reality that is just. It's rewriting the rulebook. The sources we have confirm the national debt is approaching U.S. $39 trillion. It ended 2025 at about $38.5 trillion.
Just an abstractly huge number.
It is. But, the real story isn't even the total size of the debt. It's the cost of carrying it.
The maintenance cost.
Exactly. And here's the number that really changes everything for this deep dive. 2026, that's the year the world's biggest economy is projected to hit $1 trillion milestone.
And not a good one.
Not a good one at all.
Yeah.
$1 trillion in interest payments on its debt, just interest.
Before a single dollar is spent on defense or healthcare or anything else.
That's the one.
That is the figure you should circle and highlight, because it's not just a big number. It represents a profound structural change.
Put that in context for us. $1 trillion.
Okay, think about it like this. If you look at total discretionary spending in the U.S. budget, the money for the Department of Defense, NASA, the FBI, that $1 trillion interest cost will soon rival the entire defense budget.
Wow.
We're now spending the equivalent of a major military's annual budget just to pay the interest on past decisions.
So that completely shifts the framework, doesn't it? The interest payment goes from being just another expense to a kind of permanent operating cost that's competing with everything else.
Precisely. And what's fascinating, or maybe terrifying, is that this figure, $1 trillion a year in interest, is quickly becoming the accepted baseline.
The new normal.
The new financial baseline, that's the exact phrase the Nonpartisan Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget is using. It's no longer seen as an emergency, it's just the cost of doing business.
Which creates a cycle.
A relentless, self-fulfilling cycle. That's the key mechanism you have to understand. This interest expense makes the fiscal shortfall bigger. And the only way to cover that shortfall is to...
Issue more debt.
Exactly. The U.S. has to keep going back to the market, asking the world to lend it even more money, just as the cost of its old debt is hitting this new financial baseline.
So Washington has to find buyers who are willing to absorb all these new bonds.
And stomach the risk.
And this is where the conversation almost involuntarily turns to Asia.
It has to.
Because that region is home to Washington's biggest foreign creditors.
Yeah.
They are absolutely essential for keeping the Treasury market running smoothly.
If we look at the actual balance sheets, the top two foreign holders are both in Asia.
Let's name them.
Japan. They hold nearly $1.2 trillion in U.S. debt. They're the biggest foreign creditor we have.
And number two.
China. They've reduced their holdings quite a bit over the last decade, but they still hold around $689 billion.
That's an enormous amount of geopolitical exposure concentrated in just two countries.
One key ally and one strategic rival.
Which raises a really important, maybe skeptical question. If you're sitting in an office in Tokyo or Beijing, and you're looking at the U.S. fiscal trajectory, approaching $39 trillion in debt, $1 trillion in interest payments, why on earth would you choose to increase your exposure? It just seems like bad financial management on the surface.
And that is the critical point. The traditional reason has always been about trade, not really about trust or investment wisdom.
How so?
Well, both Japan and China are just giant exporting economies. They earn massive amounts of US dollars from everything they sell, and they need those dollars for their own transactions, buying commodities, keeping their currency stable.
So they have to park that cash somewhere.
Exactly. And historically, there was just no better, no deeper, no more secure market than U.S. Treasuries. It was the default global reserve asset. It wasn't really a strategic choice so much as a financial necessity for being a global exporter in a dollar world.
And their buying helps us.
Massively. Their participation stabilizes demand for our debt, which in turn helps keep our interest rates and that trillion-dollar payment lower than they would be otherwise.
But it sounds like that necessity might be wearing thin.
It is.
Because given this trajectory, which is really pushing the limits, the sources we're looking at suggest that leaders like Japanese Prime Minister Sanai Takaichi and China's Xi Jinping are getting reluctant.
Reluctant to just keep absorbing all this new debt to fund the American shortfall.
So if the financial need is so strong, what's changing for them now? Why is that risk-reward calculation shifting?
Because the risk is becoming quantifiable and political. When the sheer volume of U.S. debt hits this kind of scale, the threat of inflation or a major credit downgrade gets more real.
So the traditional reasons for holding the debt safety, guaranteed returns, start to weaken.
They start to weaken. And when that happens, those dollar holdings transform almost overnight from being passive financial assets into very powerful geopolitical tools. Or, maybe better put, active levers.
Explain that mechanism. How does their reluctance give them leverage?
It's pretty direct. Let's say the U.S. needs to issue another $100 billion in new debt. If the traditional buyers, Tokyo and Beijing, just signal a little hesitation, maybe they reduce their purchases by a small amount.
Washington has to find other buyers.
Right. And to attract those new buyers, what does the U.S. have to do?
Offer a better return, a higher interest rate.
Precisely. So their reluctance immediately drives up the cost of U.S. borrowing, which just accelerates that trillion-dollar intercycle we were talking about. And that, right there, is their leverage.
Which explains why Washington has to listen so closely. And we actually have concrete, recent evidence of this tension. This isn't just theory.
No, it's very real.
Take the question raised by Takeshi Yamaguchi. He's the chief Japan economist at Morgan Stanley, MUFG. He just flatly asked whether Japan might use U.S. Treasury holdings as a geopolitical lever.
The fact that a mainstream economist is even asking that question publicly tells you how much the conversation has shifted.
And it reminds me of that statement from last year, which really shows the thinking inside Japanese policy circles now.
You mean former Finance Minister Katsunobu Kato?
That's the one. He was quoted last May saying that when it comes to Japan's massive $1.2 trillion in U.S. treasuries, and I'm quoting here, everything that could be a bargaining tool should be on the table.
Think about that phrasing. A bargaining tool. It's no longer just a safe asset, it's seen as ammunition.
And this idea, this willingness to use debt holdings as a political tool, it actually has a history. It's not some new invention of the 2020s.
You're right. Connecting this to the bigger picture, you can find evidence going all the way back to the late 90s.
Let's hear it.
It was 1997, decades before this current crisis. The Japanese Prime Minister at the time, Ryutaro Hashimoto, told an audience in New York that Japan had been tempted to sell lots of U.S. treasuries several times.
Yeah, why?
Specifically, he said, to make a point in disagreements over trade or diplomacy.
And the source material even gives us the context for that threat, right? That making a point was directly tied to those heated auto negotiations that happened just a few years before his comments.
It was. So even back then, the threat of destabilizing U.S. bond markets was seen as a legitimate tool to get an advantage in a trade dispute. And that was long before the U.S. debt hit these kinds of existential levels.
Okay, so now we have to pivot and look at China, because that adds a whole other layer of complexity.
A very different layer. Japan is a key ally, even if there's friction. China is a strategic rival.
So for Beijing, the motivation to leverage its $689 billion holding isn't just about trade disputes.
It goes way beyond that. For China, this is complicated by their explicit long-term goal of de-dollarization.
Right, reducing their exposure to the U.S. financial system.
To insulate themselves from potential sanctions and, to diminish America's global monetary power. So reluctance from Beijing isn't just about getting lower tariffs, it's about pushing a fundamental geopolitical goal.
And this U.S. fiscal crisis just gives them a perfect excuse.
A powerful, economically rational excuse for Xi Jinping to speed up a process he already wanted anyway, moving away from dollar dependence.
So we have Japan and China, both holding staggering financial leverage over the U.S., but driven by totally different strategic goals.
That's it. Japan is leveraging debt to secure better outcomes as an ally. China is leveraging it to fundamentally weaken U.S. financial power as a rival.
But both actions lead to the exact same result for the U.S. Treasury market.
Higher yields, higher interest payments, and a faster deterioration of the U.S. fiscal situation.
That really is the synthesis we need to walk away with here. The scale of U.S. debt interest, that new baseline of $1 trillion a year, is colliding with the stated willingness of these key creditors to use their holdings as active tools of geopolitical leverage.
It's a profound shift in the power dynamic.
The reliance of the U.S. on its foreign creditors is now more pronounced and certainly more politicized than at any point since the dollar became the reserve currency.
And for you, the listener, what this means is that any evidence of reluctance, even a small shift in buying strategy from Asia, could just reverberate through global markets in wild ways.
Right.
Understanding the balance sheet is now the same as understanding the balance of power.
So to summarize the key takeaway here, the U.S. is walking into an era defined by trillion-dollar interest payments.
And this is forcing its major creditors in Asia, both ally and rival, to question the wisdom of continuing to fund that debt. What used to be a simple necessity of global trade
Holding dollars.
is now visibly turning into a high-stakes geopolitical negotiation where the financial health of the U.S. itself is the main bargaining chip.
And that leads us to our final provocative thought for you to consider. If the traditional, purely financial reasons for holding U.S. debt are being overshadowed by these intense geopolitical concerns from Tokyo and Beijing, how might Washington have to fundamentally change its diplomatic strategy, not its monetary policy, but its diplomacy, to ensure the smooth financing of this massive new baseline of debt?
Does keeping your interest rates low now require political appeasement?
And what price might that exact on U.S. foreign policy objectives down the road?